Once upon a time, the name Burkina Faso was whispered only with pity, hunger, dust, and dependency. Today, that same name echoes across ministries and boardrooms after a deal worth $2.6 billion was placed on the table. A nation once forced to stretch out its hand now dares to extend it as an equal. At the heart of this shift stands a young soldier turned statesman, Ibrahim Traoré. In a single decade, he asks, can a landlocked country of farmers rewrite not only its economy, but its dignity? The answer begins with soybeans, but it does not end there. For what is at stake is larger than grain, larger than trade. It is sovereignty itself. Picture this moment, a dusty road where a farmer bends to the soil, hearing on his radio that a contract has been signed worth more than he ever imagined. Is this number only a promise or the first bridge to a different future? Stay with us. This is more than contracts and crops. It is a glimpse of Africa rewriting her name. Subscribe and walk with us because this story is the seed of a future our ancestors prayed for. The announcement came with little fanfare, but its echo reached far beyond Ouagadougou. In late 2023, Burkina Faso announced a decade-long partnership with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, with a value of $2.6 billion. For a landlocked country with a population of around 23 million, whose primary exports have historically been raw cotton and small quantities of livestock. This amount was not merely substantial, it was unprecedented. What are the specific terms of this agreement? It's not a straightforward payment or a single transaction, but rather a comprehensive 10-year plan, broken down into key areas that have the potential to transform the nation's future. 30% into infrastructure, silos to hold harvests that once rotted in the open sun. Roads stretch from Ouagadougou to the borders, reducing the endless delays that suffocate trade. Even rails plan to link the landlocked heart to ports in Ghana. A dream spoken of for decades but rarely acted upon. 25% into processing plants, factories for soybean oil, for animal feed, for biodiesel. For too long, Burkina exported raw crops at low value only to import finished goods at high prices. Now the commitment was to generate employment within the country and to have profits benefit the villages where the crops were grown. 20% of the funds are allocated to science and technology, including new irrigation methods, seeds that can withstand drought, and drones to help with planting schedules. In a region where farmers have traditionally relied on prayer for rain, this investment means fewer wasted hopes and more successful harvests. 15% into cooperatives and training. Women who already formed nearly 40% of soybean farmers would receive credit lines and technical support. Youth once boarding buses south toward Accra or Lagos would instead be taught how to manage machinery, how to lead cooperatives, and how to turn soil into livelihood. 10% into finance and security, a national export bank to shield farmers from the volatility of the global markets, insurance against droughts and floods, and local security for villages that feed the nation so that crops could travel safely to markets. When the figures were explained, skeptics abroad dismissed it as overambitious. Yet for many in Burkina Faso, it felt less like a fantasy and more like justice that was long overdue. In 2019, the nation produced only about 51,000 tons of soybeans. By 2023, that number had jumped to 129,000 tons, an increase of almost 150% in just 5 years. The land had already demonstrated its capabilities. The agreement was merely a way to speed up its progress. For Saudi Arabia, the reasoning was just as compelling. In the desert nation where water is limited, importing animal feed and soybean oil was vital for maintaining food supplies. For its energy transition, biodiesel offered a cleaner fuel option. The partnership then was not paid. It was an exchange. Soil for security, harvest for stability. But perhaps the most striking element of the announcement was the language used by Ibrahim Traoré himself. He did not speak of charity. He did not bow with gratitude. Instead, he spoke of partnership. One brings the land, the other brings the market, he said. Together, we build dignity. It was a clear departure from the past. when African leaders often use the language of loans and reliance. However, written contracts can often seem far removed from the lives of the people they are meant to affect. On a road near Bobo Dioulasso, a farmer named Musa learned of the news from a crackling radio. He sat down his home, looked at his two children, and wondered if their future had just changed. Would these billions mean shoes for school, medicine when they fell ill? Or would it be another grand promise spoken in capitals but forgotten in the fields? That tension between hope and doubt hung heavy because history has not been kind. For decades, Burkina Faso was told it could not rise beyond the limits set by others. Aid shipments arrived, but with strings attached. Loans were offered, but interest buried nations deeper in debt. Even when crops were successfully grown, they were exported in their raw form and then re-imported as finished products at a cost 10 times higher. This agreement, therefore, is not just about financial matters. It is a direct challenge to that history. It asks, can a small landlocked country finally claim its seat at the trading table without bending its knee? As the signing ceremony concluded, cameras captured only handshakes. But far from the marble holes, ordinary people asked sharper questions. Would silos truly rise? Or would money vanish into foreign accounts? Would factories really employ locals? Or would outsiders take the contracts? Would women farmers gain their promised credit? Or would promises evaporate under bureaucracy? Such questions remain unanswered. The ink is dry, but ink alone has never fed a child. And so, at the conclusion of this initial stage, the story is at a delicate juncture. The $2.6 billion is now officially recorded in the agreements. The world has taken note, the people are in anticipation, and the land is prepared. But contracts are only ink. The question is, will they turn into bread on the table, or another promise lost to dust? When news of the $2.6 billion agreement broke, it did not stay locked in government halls. It traveled fast through dusty markets, across villages, carried by radios and whispered in bus stations. In Ouagadougou, a taxi driver heard the announcement crackle over his dashboard radio. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel and muttered, "We have heard promises before." To him, numbers meant little unless fuel prices dropped or his children's school fees became manageable. But in Koudougou, a women's cooperative gathered under a metal roof, and the atmosphere was entirely different. Mariam, their leader, addressed the 30 farmers, stating, "They are not just purchasing our beans, they are also constructing our processing facilities, our roads, and our schools." Her words sparked a wave of joyful cries, the kind of emotional outburst women make when they feel hope is finally attainable. Across the Sahel, the echoes multiplied. In Mali, whispers turned to ambition. If Burkina can secure this for soybeans, can we not do the same with cattle? In Nature, farmers said, if they can sell beans, why not our rice? Sense of possibility moved through the region like fire across dry grass. The Sahel Alliance, once seen as a military pact, began to look like an economic community in the making. The international stage, too, could not stay silent. In Europe, newspapers wrote with surprise. Commentators acknowledged, we were not prepared for this speed and this magnitude. While there was certainly admiration, there was also a sense of apprehension. If Burkina Faso could negotiate with Saudi Arabia as an equal, what would that imply for the established order? The dependency crafted through Paris and Brussels for decades. In Asia, the reaction was sharper. Chinese observers quietly studied Burkina's cooperatives, considering whether their own agribusinesses should move in. In New Delhi, India's press wondered aloud whether the deal signaled a new era of South-South trade. Even Brazil, a titan in soybeans, tipped its hat, offering technical cooperation rather than competition. But in the West, silence came with tension. Washington and Paris issued no grand statements, but think tanks began warning of instability. Words like risk and uncertainty filled reports. Beneath polite language lay fear that Africa was no longer waiting for permission. Inside Burkina Faso itself, the atmosphere grew electric. On university steps in Ouagadougou, students debated fiercely. Some hailed Traore as a visionary. If they call him reckless, let him be reckless for freedom. Others warned of the history. Contracts have failed us before. It was in those moments that Ibrahim Traoré's presence mattered most. Rather than remaining in air-conditioned offices, he appeared in villages sitting cross-legged under baobab trees, sharing porridge with farmers. His message was straightforward. Your labor is the backbone of Burkina. Your land is the nation's treasure. Together we will make our mark on the world. These actions took on a symbolic meaning. To some, they were evidence that Traore was not another out-of-touch leader, but a man deeply connected to his country's roots. To others, they raised a question. Could one man's charisma hold back the weight of global politics? Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in African-American communities, echoes of the civil rights era resonated. Older voices remembered marches where dignity, not just bread, was at stake. They looked at Burkina Faso and saw not only soybeans, but sovereignty, not only contracts, but courage. The clash of perspectives created a climax. In one corner stood hope, farmers dreaming of irrigation, youth imagining factories, women envisioning leadership. In the other corner stood doubt, the memory of corruption, the scars of abandoned projects, the suspicion that billions could vanish before touching the poor. And beyond Burkina, the world's reaction revealed its own contradictions. When Africa kneels, they call it stability. When Africa stands, they call it instability. When Africa obeys, they speak of partnership. When Africa chooses freely, they whisper recklessness. This was the high point of tension, the moment when praise, doubt, envy, and fear collided. For some, the agreement was evidence that a small country could influence the global power dynamic. For others, it was a risky venture. Yet one thing was certain. Burkina Faso was no longer being ignored, and the people themselves had to decide whether to believe. And yet, for every cheer, there was also a whisper of fear. Can Burkina truly carry such a weight? When the covenant of $2.6 billion was signed, it did not remain as figures on paper. Slowly, it began to filter into conversations in markets, into lessons in classrooms, into the daily rhythm of households. For decades, small farmers bent over millet and sorghum, never sure whether the rains would come. Now, some joint cooperatives that guaranteed fair prices for soybeans. Instead of being exploited by intermediaries, they conducted business with organizations supported by the agreement. For the first time, men like Ma were able to afford medicine for a sick child. For the first time, they considered staying rather than leaving. Women along the unseen big bone of agriculture rose in new ways. Fatimata, a mother of 5, once prayed for rain each season. Now, with irrigation pipes in her field, she prayed instead for strength. Alongside her sisters, nearly 40% of soybean farmers in the country, she discovered not only income, but leadership. They spoke at cooperative meetings, managed credit lines, and dreamed aloud about becoming directors of processing plants. Markets swelled with produce. The hum of construction replaced the silence of despair. Young men who once polished passports in preparation to depart for Lagos or Accra now maintained tractors and welding equipment. Young people who used to count the days until they could leave the country now counted the days until the next harvest. Education also underwent a transformation. Training centers opened offering lessons in agronomy, mechanics, logistics. Some classrooms still had cracked walls and old benches. But for the first time, the students saw pathways linking what they learned to jobs they might one day hold. And women rose higher. From presidents of cooperatives to voices in town councils, their presence in leadership became harder to ignore. When women rise, the nation rises, one cooperative banner declared during a regional gathering. Politically, the shift was profound. For years, Burkina had viewed the state with suspicion. They remembered broken promises, abandoned programs, and corruption. But as silos, what happens when a midnight strike in the Gulf ripples all the way to the heart of Africa? At 3:47 Doha time, the roar of Israeli F-35 jets tore across Car's sky. Precision missiles slammed into a communications hub, shaking the capital awake. Windows shattered, children cried. Smoke billowed over a city that just hours earlier had been asleep in peace. Israel called it counterterrorism. a preemptive strike. But the truth was simpler. A sovereign nation had been attacked without warning. Now imagine being in Ouagadougou, 1,000 miles away, turning on the radio to hear that headline. For many Africans, it was not just Qatar under fire. It was a recollection of their own homes, their own streets, and their families caught in conflicts they hadn't initiated. At that moment, a young leader resolved that he could no longer remain silent. Captain Ibrahim Traoré personally called Benjamin Netanyahu. "Your aircraft crossed a line," he told him. "Africa will not stay silent." It was not a threat shouted in anger, but a calm declaration that would set off a chain reaction across continents. Within hours, African capitals lit up with emergency meetings. Within a day, defense contractors in Tel Aviv were calculating billions in potential losses. For the first time, Israel discovered that when Africa speaks as one, the world listens. And here is why the story matters to you. Even if you live thousands of miles away in Chicago, Dallas, or Miami. Because if powerful nations can strike at will in Qatar today, what stops them from dragging America's sons and daughters into another endless war tomorrow? What if the next headline you read isn't about Doha or Ouagadougou, but concerns Washington itself? Stay with me, because in the following minutes, you will learn how a relatively unknown African president compelled Israel and its Western supporters to face an unexpected challenge: the power and fury of Africa. Within 6 hours of that phone call, African presidents were already coordinating statements. Within 12 hours, Netanyahu's office was scrambling to reach the African Union. And within 24 hours, Israeli defense contractors were in full panic, fearing the collapse of billion-dollar partnerships across the continent. Yet what unfolded next was not just about contracts or diplomacy, it was about dignity. Because for the first time in decades, Africa was not reacting as a bystander to someone else's war. It was shaping the response. And what followed would shake Tel Aviv more than the strike itself. The image of Israeli jets streaking across Qatar's night sky spread like wildfire across African airwaves. Radios buzzed in crowded marketplaces. Television anchors spoke in urgent tones, and WhatsApp groups filled with grainy images of Doha's skyline under fire. For much of the world, it was just another event in the Middle East. For Africa, however, it was deeply personal. The continent has endured decades of airstrikes that were justified as counterterrorism, invasions defended as humanitarian, and resource grabs framed as partnerships. Every bomb that fell on Doha echoed the long history of foreign powers, treating sovereignty as optional. In Ouagadougou, an old miner named Adama, 67 years old, woke before dawn to the sound of his battered radio. He had worked the gold pits north of the capital his entire life, hands roughened by years of labor, lungs weakened by dust. When the announcer said Israel had struck Qatar, Adama whispered to his wife, "They test Qatar today. Tomorrow they test us." For him, Traoré's voice later that morning was not just politics, it was survival. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's response was swift. He did not couch his words in diplomatic caution. He didn't wait for Europe or Washington to dictate the response. Instead, he appeared before the cameras in his military attire, his gaze firm, and stated, "No nation can target another nation's capital and expect Africa to remain silent." It was a sentence that reverberated across living rooms, mosques, churches, and crowded bus stations. It was also the moment when a continent that had too often spoken in whispers began to speak in a roar. Netanyahu, accustomed to swift backing from Washington and muted reactions from smaller nations, was suddenly confronted with a problem he had not calculated. Africa's fury. Defense planners in Tel Aviv dismissed Burkina Faso as a poor landlocked state with little leverage. But within hours, Traoré proved them wrong. Burkina Faso suspended military cooperation with Israel, canceled training programs, and terminated intelligence sharing. The Israeli ambassador sought a meeting immediately, claiming it was a misunderstanding. Traoré's response was direct and clear. The only misunderstanding is Israel's belief that Africa will